I thought that in terms of this presentation, I'd walk through the CV, cover letter, and also a quick view on how to prep for interviews. We'll go through the CV and cover letter just because I think if you nail those two, you basically got like 80% of it done, like you've done all the hard work. And then the interview, we can really just build on from there. So, and then after all of this, we'll move into a Q&A. So in terms of the bare basics of applying to a job, there are really two documents that you need to really think about, which is firstly your CV and secondly your cover letter. Your CV is just a one-page document where when you apply to a job, you just highlight your education, your experiences, and your skills. And in terms of what I typically include on a CV, or what I tell kind of my clients to include on a CV, is your education, your work experience, your leadership positions, and any extracurricular or additional information. And it's honestly as simple as that. I think a lot of people do complicate it a little bit and talk about things that they've done back in like year 9 or year 10, or like kind of really non-relevant things, but the kind of real crux of the point is that you need to be focusing on those real 4 elements there. And when you talk about your experiences, you focus on the actions you took, the output of those actions, and what the impact of those actions was. So I've given an example, which is actually from my own CV from a few years ago. So you'll see that I've said, I've refined the database of 100,000 prior investments made by PE firms, producing a detailed investor list that the firm integrated into their fundraising strategy. So that is literally just one bullet point out of many in my CV, and it's, as you can see, I've talked about what I did, which is I refined the database. I've talked about the output of that, which is I produced a detailed investor list, and then I've talked about the impact that had on the firm, which is the firm integrated it into their fundraising strategy. And the reason why I've also highlighted that 100,000 number is that whenever you talk in your CV, you want to use numerical facts and figures wherever you possibly can. And that's because when you're applying for a job in finance, these firms are very quantitative-based firms as well. So they like to see the tangible impact that you've had on the firm or on the society that you've kind of participated in numbers wherever you can, just so that there's actually kind of more flesh to the bone, if that makes any sense. So in terms of the key principles to keep in mind, these are really what I would say, which is keep it to one page with no exceptions. I think a very common mistake that people make especially in their first year of university when applying to these places, is applying with a 2 or even a 3-page CV. And the reason why I know that it's common is I've seen it in my clients and I did it myself. And I think the trap you get into is, especially for very high-performing people, which I'm sure everyone in this room is, if you go to Warwick, you feel like everything, a lot, you would feel like you've achieved a lot even in your short, call it 18 to 21 years of life experience. You've probably done very, very well at school academically from a very early age. And so it's a very easy trap for you to put a lot of information into your CV. Whereas what you really need to do is keep it to one page and really focus on the key points that you've really done. And like my kind of words of advice here is to focus on the things that you've done most recently. And if you have to delve back into kind of the historics, focus on the bits of historics that are most tangible or most relevant to the job that you're applying for. Secondly is to focus on your impact. And so what I mean by that is, again, a very common mistake that people make in their CV is they don't really focus on what their personal contribution to a project was, right? So let's say you did a bit of work experience or you worked as part of a team on a society. I've seen a lot of CVs where people say, I helped the team who then produced this, right? Like, I helped the team and the team ultimately produced this pack. And when you talk about it in that sort of sense, you're really minimizing the focus that is placed on yourself. Whereas if you focus on what actions you took and spend less time talking about what the wider team did, I think that's more impactful. So instead of saying, I worked alongside the team and they built they built this presentation, I would focus more so on the specifics of what you did within that team scope. So you could say, I researched these X elements of the presentation, collated them and put them together, working alongside a group of other individuals to produce a presentation, right? And there, just by expanding on what you've personally done, it adds more to yourself. And so you focus more on your personal impact. And there, what I would add to that sentence is then give a numerical impact of what that presentation was. Are we all following, or do I need to repeat myself? All clear? So you want to say something like, but we ended up producing this presentation and we delivered it to our investors. This resulted in an additional amount of funding of 20%, just making up a number, and obviously the context matters here. And so that kind of brings me on to that third point, which is to quantify your achievements. Wherever you have done something, don't just leave it there. Talk about the numerical impact. So that could be something like a percentage of sales increased, or if you've worked on social media for like a presentation or a social media post, it could be the percentage of followers that increased following your post. And again, where you can, you might need to benchmark that, right? So a really common one is, imagine you did something for charity and you raised X amount of money for charity, then quantify how much money that is relative to prior achievements, right? So you can say, I raised £1,000, which is a 30% increase versus the previous highest record, right? And again, that then makes your impact or your achievements much more valuable. And my little word of advice here is, if you don't really know, like take an estimated or educated ballpark figure. That's not to say that I'm saying to out and out lie, but you know, just take a guess of kind of what tangible impact it is, or ballpark it a little bit. Number 4 is to make it easier for the recruiters when they look at your CV. You need to remember that recruiters are looking through thousands and thousands of CVs for, you know, a single application at times. So you need to really make it obvious to them why they should hire you, or why they should consider you for the next stage. And so when you're looking at it from that lens, you need to kind of use those buzzwords that are associated with the position that you're applying for. So, you know, if it's applying for an analyst position in investment bank, you probably want to use big words like analyze, evaluate, you know, conduct research, estimate, etc. Those sort of buzzwords that are associated with the field. And if you can include those in those bullet points that you're mentioning, again, it's just kind of signposting to the recruiter that you've done these things, and it makes their life easier for them. I obviously don't know the ins and outs of the recruiting. I don't work in recruiting, but I've heard that some firms also just use machine analysis of a CV, right? And so they do look for buzzwords, in which case, again, it's always beneficial to make it easier for the recruiter. And then number 5 is to be consistent with formatting. I think this is kind of more of a minority point, but I've seen people kind of go from first to third person in the middle of their CV, which is just a really easy fix that I think does detract if you don't fix it. So be sure to make that, and make sure that you're consistent with how you word your CV. So either end verbs with ed, like I analyzed, played, etc., or use it like ing, so I was playing, doing, analyzing, right? Or keep it consistent is my point. And then kind of a bonus tip is to try to do everything in reverse chronological order. So your most recent experiences should come first, and then working down that particular section, so whether it's education or leadership positions or work experience, your most recent experience should come first, and then everything should follow thereafter. So you should be working backwards in time. Again, because they want to see what you've most recently done and that you're proactive and continuing to do things. All clear on this slide? Any questions? We will have time for Q&A, hopefully, at the end. So yeah. And so I guess a question might be, you might have, is, you know, how do I create a CV if I don't actually have any work experience, right? And so let's break it down. There are broadly 2 ways of getting work experience, right? You've got your formal process, which is you apply for your spring week or your summer internship, or even in some cases your grad role, right? And these are the best way of getting your kind of big, large corporate firm names onto your CV. But they're also by far the most difficult to get onto your CV at the same time, because everyone wants them. I think what I would say is don't stray away, or don't disregard the second way of getting work experience, which is those more informal or cold approach ways of getting work experience. And that's because when you're especially when you're in your kind of first or second year of university, yes, having a big, large corporate firm is important, but more so is showing that you have the technical skills to succeed in the environment. Because ultimately, whether you work at a small or large firm, if you know financial analysis, you know financial analysis, right? And so what I would say, and especially for people who've applied for spring weeks or internships around about now and get the sense that they might not necessarily be getting anything, is to start thinking about informal or cold approaching small firms. And they don't even have to be necessarily directly financial kind of services firms. They could be fintech firms, they could be tech firms, because there's going to be a place for you where you can probably still leverage financial skills or accounting skills, right? And so in terms of what I would suggest you do is, one, reach out to your friends and family. That is by far the easiest way of getting work experience, because you just get through a lot of doors or hurdles a lot quicker. But then also just do cold approaching in terms of messaging or approaching businesses in your local area. And there are really good websites for this, for kind of startups that are looking for interns. So a good website is, obviously LinkedIn as a starting point. But there was a website called Angel List Talent, which is now called Wellfound, where there are plenty of startups who are looking for interns. In a lot of cases, these internships, I won't lie, are unpaid. But at this point in your career, if you don't have a financial burden or a financial constraint, I would personally say that it's more important for you to get that bit of work experience or knowledge rather than focusing on the short-term money. And that's because whether you get this work experience or not could be the difference between whether you get a six-figure salary out of university or not. So I would kind of focus more on the long-term trajectory if you can. Obviously, people have financial constraints and stuff, which I completely understand. And speaking kind of anecdotally, this is what I actually did when I got no spring week offers. So by January, February time of my first year of university, I knew that I wasn't likely to get any spring week offers. And so I started reaching out, doing cold approaches, and ended up working for a fintech company in London for between first and second year of university. And I leveraged that experience. In fact, that little bullet point that you saw in my CV was referring to that experience right there. And actually, what was interesting is, when I did get to my interviews later down the road, or later down the process, a lot of the recruiters were very interested in what that startup experience was like, because I had a lot more responsibility and I actually had a lot of things to talk about. So I'd say definitely don't disregard the informal or cold approach. Okay, and then moving on to the cover letter. So the cover letter is a secondary document. It's got a lot less emphasis than the CV. Like, every firm basically will require a CV, whereas not all firms will mandatorily require you to submit a cover letter. However, I think that you always should, if you could, unless you specifically know from a recruiter and they've specifically told you we don't look at the cover letter, so there's no point. And the reason why I think that it's always a good idea to submit a cover letter is, why would you give the firm a reason to reject you, right? Like, if you're comparing two candidates who are exactly the same on paper, but one of them has put in the effort of putting a good cover letter out there and another one hasn't, surely you'd go with the person who's put in the additional effort, right? So in my head, I think it's just kind of risk mitigation to always apply using a cover letter. And also, we'll go through this later, but when you do write a cover letter, the process of writing a cover letter will help you in your interviews going forward. So you're basically just fast-tracking some of your interview prep ahead of time. All right, so in terms of what a cover letter actually is, it's basically a document that outlines your intentions or motivations for applying to a job and why you think that you're particularly well-suited to excel in that job. And so the order of the cover letter is as follows. You normally have an introduction where you just kind of state your intention for that particular job. Then the next 3 paragraphs are the most important, which is why you, why the firm, and why the division, and then there's a short conclusion paragraph right at the end. And again, this cover letter should be no more than a page. It probably doesn't even need to be a page. You can be pretty concise with it. So in terms of those 3 key paragraphs, why you is kind of talking about what relevant skills and experiences you possess that makes you a good fit for the firm. Why the firm is why apply to that specific firm. There are so many investment banks that all broadly do the same thing. Like, what is so special about the firm that you're applying to, or why are you particularly intrigued about that firm? And the 4th is why the division, which is what is so appealing to you about, let's say, investment banking over sales and trading or asset management? What is it that particularly appeals to you about that division? And so you need to have very comprehensive and kind of thorough answers for all 3 of those. And so hopefully let's cover that now. So, and in fact, before I even go, I know that in terms of what people say, they say why you, why the firm, why the division. What I recommend to people, my clients, and what I personally did myself was I actually did 3, 4, 2. So why the firm, why the division, and why you. That is a personal choice, but I personally think that it's the best way of getting a good flow in your cover letter, simply because once you've talked about why the firm, you're probably implicitly talking about some of the cultural parts of the firm that you're attracted to. When you're talking about the division, you're implicitly talking about some of the skills and mentality that you probably have that make you a good fit for that division. And so the why you paragraph, which is the third paragraph in this case, goes quite naturally after that. But to add more confusion, I'm actually going to start this presentation with why the division. And that's because if you're in your first or second year of university, I'm going to imagine that you're still not 100% sure on what division of the investment bank you actually want to apply to, or which one is for you. And yes, a good chunk of that will probably come with in-person experience, but you can obviously do things before that to get a sense of what division you might most be interested in. And so if you look at the left side of this presentation, there is a sense of niching down, right? So you can think about the different divisions of an investment bank. You can go, first of all, you can think, do I want to do front office, middle office, or back office? Again, I assume you guys are all pretty ambitious here, so in most cases you're all aiming for front office positions. That is things like investment banking, sales and trading, asset management, where you're client facing. So once you've narrowed it down between front office and back office, you can then narrow it down even further to IBD, or sales and trading, or asset management. Then as you get even to another layer of granularity, it's whether you want to do M&A in IBD, or if you want to do ECM or DCM, etc. And so I would just say kind of start high level and start cascading down until you really can narrow down what you want to do. That's not to say that once you've decided on one, that's the all end all. Obviously keep yourself open and available for other opportunities, but this is kind of how I would recommend figuring out what you want to do. And the reason why I think this is so important is once you know what division you're applying to, it's a lot easier to kind of focus on what news you need to know, what technicals you need to know, so everything kind of really flows from this. And so, obviously, to niche down or to cascade down this kind of waterfall, you need to actually understand or research what these different divisions do and how they operate. And the internet is really your best friend in this case. Like I managed to niche down into either IBD or infra PE, or at least PE, using solely the internet because I didn't have any spring weeks, as I mentioned. And so your best friend here is kind of things like LinkedIn, YouTube, hint my YouTube channel, like the Wall Street Oasis and other guys that you can find completely free on forums. And in terms of the factors to consider, or what I think is very easy, or in terms of what you should consider, firstly, what are your strengths, weaknesses, and interests? So for me, I did a few finance modules at university, and I found derivatives really hard. So for me, that meant that I probably wasn't as well suited to sales and trading and swaps and stuff as I was kind of pure financial analysis with DCFs and discounting cash flows back. I also found kind of M&A transactions on the internet more appealing than I did any kind of market outperformance by a big hedge fund or whatever. So those two were immediately kind of flags to me that I should maybe consider move to IBD or focus on IBD or that sort of side of finance as opposed to sales and trading. And then obviously when you do your research, keep in mind that you probably have some preconceptions about how jobs are, and what I would say is be sure to not actually just fall victim to those. Like do your own research, don't just listen to what other people tell you, because you'll obviously hear horror stories about IBD and that might put you off, but until you do your own personal research about IBD, what it's like, the sort of job that it is, I would recommend that you don't form your own conclusions without first doing your own research. And then other things to consider are, whether your chosen career path has any prerequisites. So everyone thinks, or a lot of people think private equity as a division is quite sexy, but you can't, in most cases, go straight into private equity without doing a few years in investment banking. So, it's all good aiming for private equity, but be conscious of what you might have to do to get there. And the same thing with, like, if you want to go for a hedge fund, in a lot of cases where the hedge funds recruiters are very selective of what degrees you probably have to have done at university. In most cases, it's like maths and physics. And then finally, and something that I've really come to learn or appreciate once I started the job is, what do you value in your life, which is kind of working hours versus salary and income. And believe me, as a student, I think everyone's pretty money motivated if they want to go into finance, and they completely forget to think about the other side of things, which is, the kind of work hour or toil that you have to put in to really earn that wage. So, people will go in having like a summer internship or a grad, especially summer internships, thinking, all right, I've got an internship with Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Goldman in investment banking. I'm going to be earning, 6 figures straight out of university. Then they do the internship, they're working till 1 or 2 a.m. a lot of days, and and they actually go, actually this isn't for me. So, just really do consider that point. I cannot stress that enough. And it's honestly like a bit of a crisis that I had once I joined work of, especially when you've got a steep learning curve of, is this really, really worth it? I ultimately decided it was, and I actually really enjoy my job now, by the way. But it is something that you probably should consider. Okay, so going to the why division paragraph, it basically should marry up your understanding of the jobs with your beliefs as to why you enjoy it or why it would be a good fit for you. So within the job, you need to understand what is the purpose of the job. So let's take investment banking as an example. The aim of investment banking is to help firms grow inorganically, whether that is through the acquisition of other firms or by supporting them with capital raises on the debt or equity capital markets, right? You need to understand that, what the work environment is like. So with investment banking, pretty intense, but you do get a variety of work, you do a lot of financial analysis, and you're probably working in small deal teams, right? And your personal development will skyrocket like that. And also, what are the qualities that you need to succeed? So again, if we're using the example of investment banking analyst, you need to be very detail focused, you need to be hardworking, you need to be quite analytical. So if we kind of summarize it into those three buckets of purpose, work environment, and qualities to succeed, you then need to convince the recruiter of why you are particularly well suited or why your beliefs make you a good fit for that division. So things to consider are your core values. Perhaps you're someone who's really focused on developing society or furthering society. So you can probably find a synergy between the idea of helping these large, really important businesses grow and impact society and your personal aspirations or personal values. And what's even stronger is if you can give an example of that. That finally, and then secondly, your personal traits. So again, if we go to the kind of work environment and qualities to succeed, if you have proven examples of you being analytical or working really hard or working against a tight deadline, that's a great way of showing that you have done these things that mean that you're a good fit for the division and also show that you would enjoy working in that division. So if you say something like, I, in my previous work experience, focused on helping small to medium-sized businesses grow, I therefore think that I'd really enjoy the prospect or opportunity to help even larger multinational corporate firms grow and even further my impact. That's quite a meaningful statement to say. And so that kind of ties into the third thing, which is similar experiences you've enjoyed. And finally, your motivations and ambitions. So, if you think, let's take investment banking again as the example. There's like a sharp learning curve, lots of personal development to be had. So therefore, you can talk about you'd really enjoy this division for the opportunities that it gives you to have a variety of like a varied experience and to develop a multifaceted set of knowledge. So you develop financial analysis, you develop personal speaking skills, you develop client communication skills, all of these things. So that's kind of the things that you want to tee up in your wide division paragraph. All clear? We're good? Okay. Okay, moving on to why the firm, which is it's pretty self-explanatory. Why do you want to work at that particular firm? And in terms of your cover letter, this should be the focus of your cover letter. Because it is the part of the cover letter that you have to tailor to each and every specific firm specifically. So a good kind of acid test for whether your why the firm is sufficiently tailored or not is if you could replace the name of one bank or one firm with another and it still make, broadly still make sense, but it's not tailored enough. So in terms of how I would research or prepare for the why the firm, I kind of have a 4-step process. And I think why the firm is very important because it's also a very typical interview question you get. So the more preparation you can do for this specific question, the better. So looking at step 1, which is research, I'd say to look at firstly the company website, secondly the FT for any articles related to the firm that are good, I should stress, good financial news, the annual report, and the corporate strategy docs. And those final 2 set of documents are really, really valuable, and I feel like people often overlook them because they are a hassle to go through. But you'll actually find the most valuable information, the most specific information that will really help you to tailor your why the firm paragraph to business through these 2 documents. So I wrote a cover letter for Deutsche Bank back in the day, basically entirely using these 2 things, so the annual report and the corporate strategy doc. And the recruiter themselves, I personally recommend that it was a very good starting cover letter because it showed that I'd done my research. And so in terms of things to look out for, I'd say, find out about recent deals that the firm has just completed, particularly those that are in the division that you're applying to. So no point talking about an investment banking deal if you're applying for sales or trading. Look at their core values because, in fact, let me take a step back. When I talk about why the firm, I like to talk about two specific things, or like to bucket it into two different things. The first is a technical reason as to why you're interested in the firm, and the second is a cultural reason as to why you're interested in the firm. So for your cultural reason, i.e. like the firm's cultural values or the workplace environment, etc., look at what the firm actually outlines in their core values and their core ethos. Also look at the company's strengths, and that's what's going to guide you towards those technical reasons as to why you want to work there. If, for example, again, I want to use the example of Deutsche Bank, they are very, very strong in the debt capital markets. So perhaps you have some bit of experience or interest in debt specifically, or there was something that caught your interest or attracted your eye to it. Keep that in mind. And finally, look at their long-term outlook. So if you look at, let's again say Deutsche Bank, and let's say that they've gone from a period of like really low profitability to suddenly skyrocket, then look at what those drivers are, look at what those trends are, and comment on those within your why the firm paragraph. But in section 1, I just want you to research, keep in mind all the articles that you've read, and just keep a kind of running list of the articles. The second step is to collate your information. So in a Word doc, just copy paste anything that has caught your eye, plus the link to the full website. So just like kind of summarize what you've read, and then have the full URL in case you need to refer to it later down the road. And drop down a few words as to why it's interesting to you, or how you use the info. Because when you're going through the website or these articles, the fact that you put it into a Word doc means that implicitly or subconsciously you found that piece of information interesting. So as soon as that kind of thought enters your head, copy it into a Word doc and think about why it is that you found it interesting. And do not just copy paste the whole page or you're going to find it really difficult later. Once you've got all your information from these articles into a Word doc and somewhat summarized, then think about structure. So you've got all this information, but they could be all over the place in terms of one thing could be about cultural values, one thing could be about technicals, one thing could be about long-term outlook, and it might not all be coherent. So the third step is open up a new Word doc and start transferring information from your second Word doc into this one. So, and what you're going to do here is you're going to start thinking about how can you structure your writing. So it might be the case that you want to talk about all the cultural reasons first, and then you start lumping all the stuff about the firm's culture to begin with, and then you find all the technical stuff, and then you start interweaving it with your experiences, your personal ambitions, etc. And finally, it's just a matter of writing it. And so you want to use the structure from part 3 as a guideline, and as I say, I like to give one cultural reason and one technical reason, and wherever possible, link it back to yourself. So you should have already kind of aimed or done this in your section 3 by thinking about the cultural, the technical, and your personal experiences that tie all of this together. All good? Okay, cool. And then finally, why you? And so if you follow the format I said, which is you do why the firm, why the division, and why you, the why you paragraph is kind of a catch-all. So anything you fail to implicitly mention in why the firm or why the division, you can kind of name drop here explicitly. So in why the firm, you should have talked about why your values align to the firm's, which is the cultural reason, and why its areas of technical expertise interest you. And so you've kind of already covered that part of why you implicitly. And then why the division, you should have shown that the nature of the job aligns to your specific interest, your personal attributes, and your past experiences, and that you understand and resonate with the purpose of the job. So already in these kind of first 2 paragraphs, you've implicitly let the firm know that you're a good fit in terms of these sections. So the why you should just be the kind of this should just be why the firm on the right, or why you on the right. But the end paragraph, all you have, or all that remains, is to highlight any kind of technical or soft skills that you have that will help you to succeed explicitly if you haven't already mentioned them before. Okay, now moving on. Hopefully you've submitted a very good CV and a cover letter, and you get offers or responses back from the firms that you've applied to, inviting you to interview. And so, in terms of interview questions that you will face, there are really 4 types of interview questions that you'll mainly come across, which is fit, motivational, competency, and technical. So fit are questions like, why are you interested in working for us? Motivational are kind of any questions that are related to, are you generally interested in the firm, in the division, in this as a career? So they want to gauge how much you've really looked into this or researched this career or this division. So it could be things like, what do you think are the key industry trends? The third set are competencies, which are your typical higher view, really pain in the ass questions, which are like, tell me about a time you led a team or worked against a tight deadline. And then finally, your fourth set of questions are technical, which is entirely specific to the division that you're applying for. So the reason why I stressed the cover letter is that the questions about why the firm, why the division, and why you could all come up in the fit and motivational parts of your interview. So if you've prepared adequately for why the firm, why division, and why the you, and in this have all the resources that have come together to help you create that cover letter, you can then just go and refer back to them when prepping for the interview. And so you're saving a lot of time and effort when it comes to the interview stage by having already prepped for it. And believe me, the turnaround times for interviews can be very quick, they can literally be a couple of days, maybe a week. And so if you've already done this prep in advance, it's a lot less pressure, and you can probably focus on things like technicals that you might not be as confident about at this stage. In terms of competencies, things like tell me about a time you led a team or worked against a tight deadline, there is a very clear kind of guideline or technique to follow when giving responses to these questions, which is the STAR technique, which stands for situation, task, action, and result. So when you get asked a question like, tell me about a time you led a team, first you want to set the scene and provide some context as to what you were doing. So you could be saying I was working at a fintech startup in a small team of 3 people. That is the situation, right? You're given some context as to the environment that you're working in. The task would be, we had to produce a presentation for potential investors on a very short deadline of a few days, right? And so the challenge here is you've got to produce something of very high quality with a very short timeline to do something, right? And then the next bit is the action, is where you really focus on your impact and what you did to help the team succeed. So you can then say, I worked with the team to put together a schedule of remaining activities to do. I did research, I collated this, and automated a bunch of things. Right? That is the actions that you specifically did. And then the result of this would, we ultimately prepared the investor presentation on time, and in fact, we were able to raise funding of X million, which met our expectations or exceeded our expectations. And so you see when you're giving this response, you can quite literally step by step go through situation, task, action, result, and this is like the tried and tested format for answering any competency questions. And finally, technicals was obviously the hardest. But there are resources online that you can get quite easily to help guide you. The one I use for anyone who's interested in investment banking is the Wall Street Oasis 400-page guide. I think everyone's probably seen that. And I think it was a pretty good starter one. There are other ones like the Breaking into Wall Street guide and the Rosenbaum guide, but they're a bit more technical. So in terms of if you really want to just first get to grips with technicals, start there, because they have literally the questions divided by easy, medium, hard difficulty, and they literally walk you from first principles how to understand it. So that kind of brings me, in fact, one more slide, which is kind of preparing for the interview itself, right? So I think the way I like to think about research or preparing for interviews is it's a bit of a cyclical process, right? So you'll start, you'll probably be terrible, and then you'll do more practice, you'll get less terrible, you'll identify the areas that you need to improve on, and then you'll just go again and again until you kind of incrementally, iteratively get better to a point where you can quite confidently speak on topics in front of people. So in terms of, let's start at, the first thing you have to do is obviously research. That underpins everything. And I've walked you through how to research the firm. But another thing that I'd say specifically for the interview is research what the typical questions are for your role, and sometimes even specifically at that bank. You can get quite lucky sometimes where in forums people will quite literally put down what questions they were asked from a year or two ago. And so that gives you a good idea of what you might expect. Then practice those questions, practice the technicals that you think are likely to come up. And what I used to do was I would literally record myself in front of a camera, so not that different from what I do now, but I would record myself in front of a camera and look at the response I gave. And I would see where I was stuttering, see where I was evidently less confident, and see what my body language and tonality was like. And again, I was really bad at high views, really bad at in-person interviews to begin with, and through a process of my Google Photos, if you go back to like September 2020, is just full of me speaking into a camera in a full suit. Through that iterative process, I got a lot better and can now quite confidently speak in front of people, but I generally wasn't like this just a few years ago. And then, having looked at yourself in the camera, or do whatever you need to do, look at how you can refine your response. So, for example, imagine you get a friend to ask you a technical question and you don't know what the answer is. Very obvious, go and research that technical question because it will help you in the long run. If it's a question on competency or fit or motivation and you hesitate or stutter, again, see what you can do or what areas you're less confident in and go and practice that specific part again and again and again until you're confident. So yeah, I think that broadly takes me to the end of this presentation. So we've now walked you through CV, the cover letter, and how to prep for interview. I hope that was useful, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Remember, I'm like only a year or two removed from university myself, so in terms of kind of the practicalities of applying to stuff, I hope I can give better information than the speakers and panelists you had earlier today. So, and I also don't apply it. So, yeah, any questions? Yeah.